You are marrying a janitor." My mother scoffed as she stared at the expensive cardstock in her hands. 56 invites sent. 0 RSVPs returned. My entire family boycotted my wedding. I walked down the aisle completely alone. Then my phone blew up after a guest posted a 15-second clip and captioned it, "Her groom is." I am Amani, 29 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful commercial real estate appraiser, I built my own life and escaped their toxicity, but I still maintained occasional contact. That was my first mistake. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent Atlanta suburb meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. The true breaking point happened during our traditional Sunday dinner. I had just handed my mother Vivian my wedding invitation. It was beautiful, letterpressed with gold foil, something I had spent weeks designing. She did not even open it all the way. The sharp, violent sound of ripping paper echoed across the mahogany table. She tore the heavy cardstock in half right through my name and the name of my fiancé, Julian. Then she dropped the pieces onto her china plate right next to her untouched food. "Are you completely out of your mind?" My mother Vivian asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "You intend to humiliate this family by marrying a toilet scrubber." I sat frozen, staring at the torn pieces of my invitation. I had expected pushback, maybe some snide remarks, but not this level of blatant cruelty. The rest of the table fell silent. My sister Sierra, the golden child of the family, took a slow sip of her wine. A satisfied smirk played on her perfectly painted lips. "He is not a janitor, Mother," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I told you he works in commercial property maintenance. He owns his own business. A glorified maintenance man." My father Charles chimed in from the head of the table. He wiped his mouth with a crisp linen napkin, looking at me with the same deep disappointment he had worn since I was 18 years old. The first time we met him, he showed up to our country club in paint-splattered coveralls. He smelled like industrial solvent Amani. "You expect us to sit in a pew and watch you tie your life to a man who unclogs drains for a living?" I clenched my hands under the table until my knuckles turned white. The incident my father was referring to happened several months ago. Julian had rushed straight from an emergency repair at one of the massive commercial buildings he managed, just to make it to my father's birthday lunch. He had apologized profusely for his work clothes, but my family had immediately written him off. In their world, a man wearing a blue-collar uniform was entirely invisible. They saw the paint, they saw the grease, and they stopped looking. They never bothered to ask what he actually owned. This disdain mirrored the day I rejected my law school acceptance. In my family, you were either a lawyer, a judge, or a failure. Generations of our family had built a wealthy legacy in the courtroom. When I chose to become a commercial real estate appraiser, inspecting dusty warehouses and analyzing property values, I became the black sheep overnight. Sierra had followed the script perfectly. She joined the right sorority, married a wealthy white finance executive named Preston, and secured her spot at the top of the family pedestal. I, on the other hand, was the constant embarrassment. I worked with my hands, I worked with dirt and concrete, and now I was marrying a man they believed did the exact same thing. You could have had anyone. Vivian continued, picking up her wine glass with a heavy sigh. "You are a beautiful girl, Amani. If you had just listened to us, you could be married to a partner at a law firm by now. Instead, you are bringing this disgrace into our circle. What will the people at the Oak Ridge Golf Club say about this? What will the board members think when they ask what my new son-in-law does for a living? Should I tell them he carries a mop and a bucket?" My chest tightened. The fact that she cared more about the gossip at her exclusive golf club than my happiness was a harsh reminder of who she truly was. They had always cared more about appearances than substance. You do not have to tell them anything. I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight, despite the shaking in my hands. You just have to show up. It is my wedding. I am asking my family to be there to support me on the most important day of my life. Sierra let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Support you in ruining your life, no thanks. I am not sitting through some cheap backyard wedding just to watch you throw your potential away. Besides, my husband Preston is hosting some very important investors that weekend. We actually have a reputation to maintain in this city. The cruelty in her voice was casual and effortless. She did not even look at me as she dismissed me entirely. My mother nodded in agreement with Sierra, completely ignoring my presence. The rejection hung in the air, heavy and absolute. They were not just insulting Julian, they were punishing me for refusing to fit into their perfect, pristine mold. I looked around the table. Not one single person offered a word of defense. I slowly stood up and grabbed my purse. I looked down at the torn pieces of my wedding invitation. You will all deeply regret this. Before the weight of my words could even settle in the room, a slow, patronizing clap echoed from the other end of the dining table. It was Preston, my sister Sierra's husband. He leaned back in his custom-tailored chair, a smug grin plastered across his face. He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive Italian suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed a small plastic card across the mahogany table. It slid over the polished wood and stopped right next to my torn invitation. It was a $50 Starbucks gift card. Consider this an early wedding present for you and your janitor, Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. Since you two will probably be up early scrubbing toilets and mopping floors, you are going to need the caffeine. Maybe if he saves up his tips, he can buy you a nice mop bucket for your anniversary. Sierra giggled, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. My father, Charles, chuckled softly, nodding in approval at Preston's cruel joke. I did not blink. I just stared at the little green card on the table, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. Preston adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest, leaning forward as if he was about to deliver a profound sermon. You see, Amani, there are people in this world who actually build things, and people who clean up after them. Next weekend, while you are throwing your life away in some cheap backyard ceremony, I will be hosting the most important dinner of my entire career. I am securing a $50 million lifeline for my investment fund. My mother Vivian leaned forward, her eyes wide with admiration. Oh, Preston, tell her who it is. Tell her what real success looks like so she can finally understand the standard of this family. Preston smiled, looking at me as if I was a peasant standing before a king. I am meeting with Jay Vanguard. I am sure someone at your level has never heard the name, but in the world of high finance and commercial real estate, he is an absolute titan. He is a phantom billionaire. Nobody really knows what he looks like, but his holdings control half the commercial skyline on the East Coast. My firm has been courting his private trust for 6 months. When he signs that $50 million check on Saturday, it will secure my legacy and elevate this entire family to a tier you could never comprehend. I stared at Preston as a sudden wave of clarity hit me like a physical blow. It took every ounce of my willpower not to burst into laughter right then and there. My family was so blinded by their own elitism that they never bothered to learn the full name of the man I was marrying. To them, he was just Julian, the guy in the dirty coveralls. They had absolutely no idea that his full name was Julian Vanguard, the phantom billionaire, the titan of industry, the man Preston was currently begging for a lifeline. As a commercial real estate appraiser, I had access to industry whispers. I knew Preston's fund was bleeding money. He had made several reckless investments in overvalued tech startups, and his board of directors was breathing down his neck. He desperately needed Vanguard Holdings to bail him out. I suddenly remembered a conversation Julian and I had over breakfast a few weeks ago. He had laughed about a desperate mid-level investment firm that kept sending him extravagant gifts trying to buy a meeting. Julian had called the fund manager a pathetic fraud who inflated his property valuations. Julian was planning to reject the deal entirely, but he agreed to send a proxy to their wine tasting event just to formally decline the offer in person. Preston thought this dinner next Saturday was his saving grace. He had no idea he was preparing a feast for his own executioner. Sierra reached over and placed her hand on Preston's arm, looking at him with pure adoration. Preston has been working so hard for this, Amani. This is what a real provider looks like. He operates in rooms you and your little maintenance man could never even dream of entering. You should really take notes, but I suppose it is too late for you now. I looked at the Starbucks gift card sitting on the table. I did not pick it up. Instead, I met Preston's gaze. His pale blue eyes were filled with an unearned sense of superiority. He truly believed he was the smartest man in the room. He believed his white-collar prestige made him untouchable. "You are right, Preston," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "There are people who build empires, and there are people who just pretend to. I hope your dinner with Mr. Vanguard goes exactly the way you deserve." Preston scoffed, picking up his wine glass, taking an arrogant sip. "Oh, it will. He is sending a senior representative to my wine tasting event on the very day of your wedding. It is a shame you will miss it, but I suppose you will be busy exchanging plastic rings in the dirt." I looked at my parents sitting there in their designer clothes. They were beaming at Preston, completely mesmerized by the illusion of his wealth. They had traded their own flesh and blood for the proximity to power. They were willing to boycott my wedding, the most sacred day of my life, just to play host to Preston's desperate networking event. They thought they were choosing the winning side. I slowly zipped up my purse, feeling the last remaining threads of attachment to these people snap. I looked at each of them one by one. My mother Vivian, with her harsh, judgmental eyes. My father Charles, with his quiet, cowardly complicity. My sister Sierra, drowning in her own vanity. And Preston, the arrogant fraud who thought he held the keys to the kingdom. The room grew unnervingly quiet as I prepared to leave. My tone was not angry. It was absolute. "You chose to tear up my invitation. You chose to mock the man I love. You chose to prioritize a business deal over my wedding. I will not cry over this, and I will not beg you to attend. But when the dust settles and you finally realize exactly who you threw away, do not come knocking on my door. Because there will be absolutely nothing left for you." I turned on my heel and walked out of the formal dining room. I did not look back. I could hear my mother scoffing behind me, muttering something about how dramatic I had always been. I heard Preston laugh again, a hollow, arrogant sound that echoed down the hallway. I walked out the heavy front doors of my childhood home and stepped into the cool night air. The heavy burden of seeking their approval, a weight I had carried for 29 years, suddenly lifted from my shoulders entirely. I walked to my car parked in the circular driveway. The gravel crunched under my heels. The cool night air felt refreshing against my heated skin. I unlocked my door and slid into the driver's seat. Before I could even start the engine, my phone screen lit up in the cup holder. It was a notification from the extended family group chat. The chat had 56 members, including every aunt, uncle, and cousin who had ever benefited from my father Charles and his deep pockets. I picked up the phone. There was a long paragraph sent by my father. He did not waste a single second after I walked out the door. The message was a masterclass in manipulation. He wrote that the family was honored to host an exclusive wine tasting event at the Oak Ridge Golf Club to secure a monumental partnership with Vanguard Holdings. He emphasized that this event was critical for the financial future and legacy of the entire family. Then came the ultimate betrayal. He wrote that while Amani is having a small informal ceremony on the same day, he and Vivian would be dedicating their time to Preston's event. He formally invited the entire extended family to join them at the country club instead of my wedding, promising them an evening of elite networking and open bar access that would benefit their own careers. He framed it as a choice between supporting the family's legacy or indulging my stubborn rebellion. He knew exactly what he was doing. My father controlled the trust funds. He paid for my cousin's college tuitions. He loaned money to my uncles for their failing businesses. He held the puppet strings of our entire bloodline, and he had just pulled them all at once to ensure I would be completely alone on my wedding day. I sat in the silence of my car and watched the screen. For a few agonizing minutes, there was no response. I held my breath foolishly, hoping that at least one person would stand up to him. Maybe my Aunt Clara, who used to bake me cookies when my mother ignored me. Or my cousin David, who I had tutored through high school math so he could graduate. Then the first message came through. It was from Uncle Lawrence. He wrote congratulations to Preston and said he would absolutely be at the golf club to support the family. 2 seconds later, the digital RSVP notification from my wedding website popped up at the top of my screen. Uncle Lawrence has declined your invitation. It was like a dam breaking. The group chat erupted with a flood of congratulatory messages for Preston and my parents. They shamelessly fawned over the mention of Vanguard Holdings. Every single one of them wanted a piece of the billionaire pie. They wanted to rub shoulders with the senior representative Preston had promised. They saw an opportunity to elevate their own status, and they trampled right over my wedding to get to it. My phone vibrated violently as the wedding website notifications poured in. Aunt Clara has declined your invitation. Cousin David has declined your invitation. Aunt Beatrice declined. Uncle Robert declined. It was a relentless digital firing squad. Every buzz of the phone was another family member choosing my father's money over my milestone. I scrolled through the messages, reading their pathetic excuses. Some claimed they had sudden scheduling conflicts. Others did not even bother to lie, simply stating they would see everyone at Oak Ridge. Not a single person reached out to me privately to apologize. Not one person questioned why my own parents were boycotting their daughter's wedding. They just fell in line exactly as my father commanded. The cruelty was so complete and systematic that it felt surreal. I sat there and watched the RSVP count on my wedding dashboard drop in real time. 40 attending, 30 attending, 15 attending. The numbers plummeted faster than I could process. These were people I had known my entire life. People who had smiled in my face and hugged me at Thanksgiving. People who had eagerly accepted the expensive foil-pressed invitations I had mailed out just weeks ago. Within 20 minutes, the massacre was over. The dashboard updated one final time. 0 attending. All 56 relatives had officially dropped out. I was entirely isolated. My family had effectively excommunicated me via text message, all for the chance to drink free wine and beg for scraps from a billionaire they had never even met. My chest heaved as the reality of my situation set in. I was going to walk down the aisle alone. There would be no father to give me away, no mother to help me with my veil, no sister to stand by my side, no aunts to cry happy tears from the front row. I had no one left. A single tear escaped and rolled down my cheek. I quickly wiped it away. That would be the last tear I ever shed for these people. The pain in my chest slowly hardened into something entirely different. It turned into a cold, sharp resolve. They had made their choice. They had drawn the battle lines and placed their bets on Preston and his crumbling empire. They had chosen to worship the name Vanguard without ever realizing that the man they were bowing down to was the very man they had just called a toilet scrubber. My father thought he had delivered a death blow to my spirit. He thought he had put me in my place and reminded me of my insignificance. He had no idea that he had just handed me the match to burn his entire fake kingdom to the ground. I unlocked my phone and opened my text thread with Julian. I typed a simple message. "It is just you and me now. Everyone cancelled." Julian's reply came almost instantly. "Then it will be the most perfect day of my life. Let them have their wine tasting my love. We have an empire to run." I smiled, staring at his words. The family thought they had broken me. They thought I would come crawling back begging for their forgiveness and their presence. But I was done begging. I started the engine of my car and shifted into gear. I drove away from the sprawling colonial house, knowing it would be the very last time I ever looked at it as a victim. The stage was set, and they were completely oblivious to the storm that was coming for them. Saturday arrived with a bright, cloudless sky that felt almost mocking in its perfection. The venue Julian and I had chosen was a highly secure private botanical garden, tucked away on a sprawling estate just outside the city limits. It was an absolute masterpiece of landscaping. Towering weeping willows draped their branches over manicured stone pathways. Thousands of white orchids bloomed vibrantly, clinging to the ancient oak trees that surrounded the main clearing. The air smelled of sweet jasmine and fresh earth. The private estate was surrounded by high stone walls and wrought iron gates. Julian had hired a top-tier security firm to ensure no uninvited guests could breach the perimeter. The guards stood like silent statues in the shadows of the trees, wearing sharp, dark suits and earpieces, ensuring complete and total privacy. It was a fairy tale setting completely isolated from the noise of the outside world. But as I stood hidden inside the glass conservatory, waiting for the ceremony to begin, the breathtaking beauty of the garden was entirely overshadowed by the devastating sight waiting on the main lawn. Through the glass panels, I could see the ceremony space. 56 gold chiavari chairs were arranged in perfect symmetrical rows on either side of the wide aisle. Every single chair was empty. Not one aunt, not one cousin, not my mother, not my father. The gentle afternoon breeze rustled the sheer white fabric draped over the backs of the chairs, making them look like rows of silent ghosts. 56 pristine wedding programs sat untouched on the velvet seat cushions. 56 small silk bags containing personalized favors rested perfectly aligned next to them. The sheer volume of the absence was suffocating. A string quartet sat in the corner of the lawn, playing a beautiful rendition of my favorite classical piece, pouring their incredible talent out to a completely vacant audience. My chest tightened as I traced the lines of the empty seats with my eyes. Even though I knew they were not coming, seeing the physical manifestation of their rejection was a heavy, heavy blow. The silence was deafening. I looked at the very front row where the mother of the bride and the father of the bride were supposed to sit. Small reserve signs rested elegantly on the cushions. Those small pieces of paper felt like daggers to my heart. They had actually done it. They had coordinated a mass boycott of my wedding, leaving me standing in a multi-million-dollar garden with absolutely no family to witness the most important promise of my life. I turned away from the glass panels and looked at my reflection in the full-length antique mirror resting against the conservatory wall. My custom silk gown fit perfectly, hugging my frame before cascading into a long, elegant train. As I stared at my own face, a sharp, bitter memory flashed through my mind. I was 22 years old, standing on the sunlit lawn of my university, holding my college diploma in my hands. I had just graduated magna cum laude with a degree in real estate finance. I was looking around desperately through the massive crowd of cheering families trying to find my parents. I finally spotted them walking briskly toward the parking lot away from the ceremony. I ran across the grass in my heavy cap and gown, calling out to them. When I finally caught up, breathless and smiling, my mother did not even look at my diploma. She was busy rubbing Sierra's back. Sierra had a minor headache from a sorority party she attended the night before, and she was complaining loudly that the sun was too bright. My father opened the door of his luxury sedan and told me they had to leave immediately so Sierra could rest in the air conditioning. He handed me a crumpled $20 bill, told me to catch a cab back to my apartment, and drove away. He left me standing completely alone on the grass, clutching my degree, while all the other families took photos and celebrated around me. They had always walked away from me. They had always chosen Sierra. They had always made it abundantly clear that my milestones did not matter if they slightly inconvenienced the golden child. I took a deep, steadying breath and smoothed the intricate beading on the front of my gown. That scared 22-year-old girl standing on the campus lawn was gone. I was 29 now, and I was no longer waiting for a cab that my father threw $20 at. I was about to walk down an aisle built by a man who saw my infinite worth when my own bloodline treated me like a burden. The wedding planner, a kind woman named Claire, stepped into the conservatory. She had tears pooling in her eyes, having realized an hour ago that nobody was showing up from my side of the guest list. She gently touched my arm and asked in a soft whisper if I wanted to delay the start time for a few more minutes, just in case someone was running late. I shook my head. I told her to cue the music. I did not want to wait another second for people who were never going to arrive. I reached up and pulled my sheer veil over my face. I grabbed my large bouquet of white calla lilies, holding them firmly with both hands to stop my fingers from trembling. The heavy glass doors of the conservatory opened. The warm afternoon breeze caught the edge of my veil, lifting it slightly. The string quartet smoothly transitioned into the processional march. I stepped out onto the stone pathway. The bright sunlight caught the pearls on my bodice, making them shimmer. I did not look down. I did not let my shoulders slump. I locked my knees and forced myself to take the first step and then the next. I walked past the first row of empty chairs. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone, echoing loudly in the quiet garden. With every step I took past an empty row, a different piece of my toxic past fell away. I walked past the third row, the fourth row, the fifth row. I let my eyes sweep over the barren landscape of my familial ties. I walked past the chairs meant for my aunts who had always judged my weight. I walked past the chairs meant for my uncles who had laughed at my career choice. I walked past the front row, meant for the parents who had never truly loved me. I was completely alone, but for the first time in my entire life, I did not feel lonely. I felt an overwhelming sense of ultimate liberation. The ghost sitting in those empty gold chairs could no longer hurt me. I was walking through the graveyard of my family expectations, and I was coming out alive and victorious on the other side. I lifted my chin higher. I refused to let the empty seats define this beautiful moment. This was not a funeral for my family. This was the birth of my own empire. As I neared the end of the stone pathway, the massive floral arch came into full view. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, entirely focused on the future waiting for me. I reached the end of the stone pathway and stepped onto the raised marble platform beneath the floral arch. Julian was waiting for me. He took my hands in his, and the warmth of his touch instantly melted away the last lingering chill of my family's absence. He did not look like the maintenance man my parents had so viciously mocked. He was wearing a midnight blue bespoke tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly. His posture was commanding yet completely at ease. He looked at me with an intensity that made the entire world fade away. There was no pity in his eyes as he glanced at the 56 empty chairs behind me. There was only deep burning admiration for the woman who had the strength to walk past them. I turned my attention to the small group of people standing on Julian's side of the altar. Because my family had entirely boycotted the wedding, Julian had asked his closest confidants to stand as our witnesses. I had met them briefly during our engagement, but seeing them standing here in the flesh suddenly added a staggering layer of reality to the life I was about to enter. The man holding the leather-bound vow book preparing to officiate our ceremony was not a local pastor. It was the mayor of Atlanta. He offered me a warm, respectful nod. Next to him stood two men serving as Julian's groomsmen. One was the founder of a global tech conglomerate whose software powered half the financial institutions in the country. The other was the managing director of an international hedge fund that routinely moved billions of dollars across overseas markets. These were men who graced the covers of elite financial magazines. These were the titans of industry that my brother-in-law Preston spent his entire life desperately trying to emulate. Yet here they were, standing quietly in a private garden, deferring completely to Julian. The way they looked at my soon-to-be husband spoke volumes. There was no casual arrogance. There was absolute reverence. They knew exactly who Julian Vanguard was. They knew the empire he had built from the ground up, and they respected him not just as a billionaire, but as a visionary who commanded loyalty without ever having to demand it. The mayor stepped forward and began the ceremony. His voice was rich and grounding, echoing softly through the quiet garden. He spoke about the rare kind of partnership that is built on mutual respect rather than convenience. He spoke about the courage it takes to choose love over societal expectations. I listened to his words feeling a profound sense of validation. My family had spent my entire life telling me I was making the wrong choices. They told me I was foolish for inspecting properties instead of studying law. They told me I was throwing my life away by marrying a blue-collar worker. But standing here surrounded by the most powerful men in the city, I realized my instincts had always been flawless. I had recognized Julian's brilliance when he was covered in paint and drywall dust. I saw his soul before I ever saw his bank account. Julian squeezed my hands, drawing my attention back to his face. It was time for our vows. We had chosen to write our own. He did not pull out a piece of paper. He just looked directly into my eyes. His voice was steady and deep, carrying a promise that I knew would outlast time itself. He told me that he had spent his life building foundations for skyscrapers, but none of it mattered until he found the woman who could be the foundation of his life. He looked at the empty lawn behind me and then looked back at me. He promised that I would never have to walk alone again. He promised that he would spend every day of his life ensuring that anyone who ever made me feel like an option would have to answer to him. He did not promise me a fairy tale. He promised me an empire built on truth and unyielding loyalty. Tears pricked my eyes, but they were tears of overwhelming joy. When it was my turn, I promised to stand by his side in the boardrooms and in the dirt. I promised to honor the man he was and the man he was becoming. I promised to protect our peace against anyone who tried to disrupt it, regardless of their bloodline. The mayor smiled warmly as we exchanged rings. They were not the cheap plastic rings Preston had joked about. Julian's ring to me was a flawless custom-cut diamond surrounded by rare sapphires. My ring to him was a solid band of platinum forged to withstand anything. The mayor pronounced us husband and wife. Julian pulled me in and kissed me. The small group of billionaires erupted into genuine applause, their cheers filling the quiet garden. As we turned to walk back down the aisle together, the string quartet began to play an upbeat, triumphant melody. Julian wrapped his arm tightly around my waist, pulling me close. We walked past the rows of empty gold chairs, but this time I did not even glance at them. The void my family left behind was no longer a wound. It was simply empty space that had already been filled by a man who possessed more integrity and power in his little finger than my entire bloodline combined. We reached the end of the aisle and walked toward the private reception tent set up near the edge of the estate. The tech billionaire who had stood as Julian's best man clapped him on the shoulder, handing him a glass of vintage champagne. He raised his own glass toward me, welcoming me into the family. He then pulled out his phone with a wide grin, capturing a short video of Julian and me, toasting with our champagne. He tapped his screen a few times, posting the short clip to his private professional network before sliding the phone back into his tailored pocket. Inside the luxurious tent, the lighting was soft and warm. Crystal chandeliers hung from the draped ceiling, illuminating long tables adorned with white orchids and burning candles. The catering staff moved silently, offering exquisite appetizers. It was an intimate gathering, but the concentration of wealth and influence in that single tent was staggering. I took a sip of my champagne, feeling the cool liquid soothe my throat. I looked at my new husband, laughing easily with the mayor. The storm my family had tried to drown me in had completely passed, but little did I know miles away in a stuffy country club ballroom, another storm was just beginning to brew, and it was heading straight for Preston and my parents. 30 miles away, the atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Golf Club was entirely different. The room was draped in heavy velvet and gold accents, a desperate attempt to project an image of untouchable wealth. A string quartet played in the corner, but their music was drowned out by the loud, forced laughter of the city's elite. Preston stood near the mahogany bar, his face flushed, and a thin layer of sweat glistening on his forehead. He adjusted his collar, feeling the sudden suffocating heat of the room, despite the blasting air conditioning. He held a glass of expensive Pinot Noir in his hand, swirling it nervously as he nodded along to a dull story being told by an older investor. Preston was dying inside. The event had been going on for over an hour, and the senior representative from Vanguard Holdings had not arrived. Preston excused himself from the circle of investors, forcing a confident smile that did not reach his eyes. He walked briskly out of the ballroom and down the carpeted hallway toward the restrooms, checking over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching him. He pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking slightly. He dialed the direct office line for Julian Vanguard's executive assistant for the 5th time that afternoon. The line rang twice before an automated corporate voice system picked up. He pressed 0 desperately, trying to reach a human being. Finally, a polite but firm voice answered. Preston immediately launched into his pitch, his voice an octave higher than usual. He demanded to know the estimated arrival time of the Vanguard proxy, claiming that the other investors were waiting for the keynote address. The assistant on the other end of the line was completely unbothered by his panic. She calmly informed him that Vanguard Holdings had no record of a representative being dispatched to the Oak Ridge Golf Club that evening. Preston felt the blood drain from his face. He leaned against the cool, patterned wallpaper of the hallway, gasping for air. He told the assistant there had to be a mistake. He cited the emails he had sent, the extravagant gifts he had delivered to their corporate headquarters. The assistant simply repeated her statement and politely disconnected the call, leaving Preston listening to the dial tone. His entire hedge fund was sitting on the edge of a cliff. He had spent the last 2 years inflating the value of his commercial real estate portfolio by over 40%. He used those fake numbers to secure massive loans, and if Vanguard did not buy out his toxic assets, the federal auditors would eventually notice the glaring holes in his ledger. He was not just facing bankruptcy, he was facing federal prison. And Vanguard was his only parachute. If the other investors in the ballroom figured out he was bluffing about the $50 million partnership, they would pull their remaining capital by Monday morning. He would be ruined. Preston wiped his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief and shoved his phone back into his pocket. He took a deep breath, pasting the arrogant smirk back onto his face before pushing the heavy oak doors open to re-enter the ballroom. He needed to buy more time. Across the room, my family was completely oblivious to his impending downfall. They were standing near an elaborate ice sculpture, holding crystal glasses and basking in the artificial glow of their own perceived superiority. My mother, Vivian, wore a heavily beaded silver gown that caught the light every time she moved. She took a delicate sip of her wine and smiled at a passing country club board member. "Can you believe the weather today?" Vivian asked, her voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "It is absolutely dreadful to think of anyone having an outdoor event right now. The humidity alone would ruin a good dress. Thank goodness we decided to host this lovely indoor gathering instead." Sierra laughed, leaning into her husband as Preston joined their circle. She ran a hand down the lapel of his suit, entirely missing the frantic look in his eyes. "Oh, Mother, do not pretend you are worried about the weather," Sierra sneered. "We all know Amani's little backyard party was going to be a disaster regardless of the forecast. I bet they are serving lukewarm chicken and drinking cheap sparkling wine out of plastic flutes right now. Can you imagine the embarrassment of standing in the dirt, saying vows to a man who literally scrubs grout for a living?" Charles chuckled, swirling the dark red liquid in his glass. He puffed his chest out, looking around the extravagant ballroom with deep satisfaction. "It is a lesson she had to learn the hard way," Charles said, his tone dripping with patriarchal arrogance. "I told her from the beginning that this family has standards. We build relationships with people who matter. Look around this room. We have the top financial minds in the state right here. We do not lower ourselves to accommodate a blue-collar fantasy. When she finally wakes up and realizes what she threw away, we will be the ones laughing." Vivian nodded in agreement, completely satisfied with the narrative she had spun for her friends. She had spent the entire evening telling the wives of the board members that Amani was simply going through a rebellious phase. She claimed the groom was a humble charity case that Amani felt sorry for. It was a masterful spin designed to make the family look magnanimous while entirely erasing Julian's actual existence. She cared more about protecting her reputation among the country club wives than she did about the fact that her daughter was walking down an aisle completely alone. Preston stood beside them, his jaw clenched tight. A prominent venture capitalist approached their circle, clapping Preston heavily on the shoulder. The older man looked around the room, raising an eyebrow. "So, Preston, where is this mystery representative you promised us?" the man asked, his voice booming over the background music. "You have been dangling the Vanguard name all month. I cleared my Saturday schedule for this. We are all waiting to see if this $50 million injection is real or just another one of your tall tales." Preston forced a booming laugh that sounded hollow and unnatural. "Oh, you know how these billionaires operate?" Preston lied smoothly. "They run on their own schedules. His office assured me he is on his way. Just enjoy the open bar and the caviar. We will have our formal presentation shortly." The investor gave Preston a long, calculating look before nodding slowly and walking away. Preston swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He looked at Sierra, who was still smiling vacantly, and then at Charles, who was busy trying to catch the attention of a local politician. They were completely useless to him. They were empty vessels of vanity playing dress-up in a world they did not actually control. Preston knew he was out of time. He reached into his pocket to check his phone one more time, praying for a miracle. He had no idea that the miracle he was begging for was currently putting a wedding ring on the finger of the woman his family had just thrown away. The clinking of crystal glasses and the dull hum of arrogant conversations continued to fill the ballroom of the Oak Ridge Golf Club. Preston stood near the edge of the room, pretending to inspect a bottle of expensive Merlot while his stomach twisted in agonizing knots. He watched Charles and Vivian laughing loudly with the wives of the board members continuing their pathetic charade. Sierra was busy taking selfies near the ice sculpture, completely unaware that her luxurious lifestyle was currently hanging by a very thin thread. At the center of the room stood Richard Montgomery. Richard was the most ruthless venture capitalist in the city and the unofficial leader of the investors Preston had invited. Richard was growing visibly impatient with the endless delays. He pulled his smartphone from the inner pocket of his tailored suit and began scrolling through his professional networks, likely checking the status of international markets to pass the time. He opened his private feed. Suddenly, the low murmur of the room was interrupted by a sharp intake of breath. Richard let out a loud gasp that cut through the background music like a knife. He stopped walking and stared down at his glowing screen. His eyes were wide with absolute shock. Several board members turned to look at him, wondering if there had been a sudden crash in the stock market or a major corporate scandal. Preston immediately rushed over, forcing his fake confident smile back onto his face. He asked Richard if everything was all right, silently praying that the Vanguard representative had finally sent an email apologizing for the delay. Richard did not look at Preston. He did not say a single word to him. Instead, Richard walked with urgent purpose toward the front of the ballroom, where a massive 80-inch smart television had been set up for Preston's upcoming financial presentation. Richard grabbed the remote control from the presentation podium. With a few quick taps on his phone, he bypassed Preston's slide deck and cast his own screen directly onto the massive display. The sudden bright flash of the television drew the attention of every single person in the room. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. The waiters paused with their trays of caviar. Charles, Vivian, and Sierra stopped laughing and turned their heads toward the front of the room. Preston stood frozen near the podium, entirely confused by Richard's erratic behavior. "Look at this," Richard said, his voice echoing loudly across the silent ballroom. "It is a post from the founder of Global Tech Dynamics just 2 minutes ago. He is at a private event." The massive screen illuminated, displaying the social media feed in high definition. The caption above the video was written in bold black letters for the entire room to see. It read, "Honored to attend the private wedding of my brother Jay Vanguard, the new power couple of commercial real estate." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd of wealthy investors. The name Vanguard held an almost mythical weight in this room. They all leaned forward, eager to finally catch a glimpse of the phantom billionaire that Preston had been promising them all night. Preston felt a sudden rush of temporary relief, thinking that this video would somehow prove his connection to Vanguard Holdings. He smiled broadly, puffing out his chest as the 15-second clip began to play. The video started with a sweeping shot of a breathtaking private botanical garden. The lush green trees and pristine white floral arrangements made the country club ballroom look incredibly cheap and tacky in comparison. Then the camera panned toward the reception tent, capturing the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. The person holding the phone walked forward, moving toward the center of the tent. Preston held his breath, waiting to see the face of his savior. Charles and Vivian stepped closer to the screen, their eyes wide with greedy curiosity. Sierra crossed her arms, leaning her head to get a better look at the screen. The camera finally focused on the groom. He was standing near a beautifully decorated table holding a glass of vintage champagne. He was wearing a flawless midnight blue custom tuxedo that radiated pure power and authority. He turned slightly toward the camera, offering a relaxed, confident smile. He raised his glass in a toast. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The air was sucked out of the room so fast, it felt like a physical blow. Preston stopped breathing entirely. The confident smile on his face melted away, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. His hands began to shake so violently that his wine glass slipped from his fingers and shattered loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Red wine splashed across his expensive Italian shoes, looking exactly like fresh blood. He recognized the face on the massive screen. It was a face he had mocked just a few days ago. It was the face of the man he had thrown a $50 gift card at. Vivian let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both of her hands. Her eyes bulged as she stared at the television, unable to process the image in front of her. Charles stood completely paralyzed, his jaw hanging slack as he looked at the groom. Sierra dropped her designer clutch, spilling her expensive makeup across the floor, her perfectly painted lips trembling in shock. The man on the screen, the phantom billionaire, the titan of industry J. Vanguard, was Julian. It was the man they had relentlessly mocked. It was the man my family had boycotted my wedding over because they thought he scrubbed toilets for a living. But the video was not over. The camera shifted slightly to the right, capturing the bride standing next to Julian. She was wearing a stunning custom silk gown, her head held high, and a radiant smile on her face. Julian wrapped a protective arm around her waist, pulling her close as they toasted the camera together. The bride was me, Amani, the daughter they had thrown away, the sister they had abandoned to the empty chairs. The video looped and began to play again. The caption remained burned into the bottom of the screen, solidifying the impossible reality. Honored to attend the private wedding of my brother J. Vanguard. Richard turned away from the television and looked directly at Preston. The venture capitalist had a look of absolute disgust on his face. Preston, you told us Vanguard was sending a representative to this dinner. Richard said, his voice cold and sharp. You told us you were securing a $50 million partnership with him today. Yet he is currently at his own wedding. A wedding you are entirely absent from. Richard looked back at the screen, studying the bride. He squinted his eyes, recognizing my face from a brief introduction Charles had made years ago. Richard turned his piercing gaze toward my father. Charles, is that not your youngest daughter on the screen? Richard asked the entire room, hanging on his every word. Did you just host a networking event to try and solicit money from your own son-in-law while simultaneously boycotting his wedding? Charles tried to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped his throat. He looked like a man who had just been convicted of a massive crime. Vivian swayed on her feet, looking like she was about to faint right there on the carpet. Sierra grabbed her husband's arm, digging her nails into his expensive suit jacket, but Preston did not even notice her. Preston was simply staring at the 15-second clip of Julian Vanguard, the janitor who was currently holding the absolute power to destroy his entire life. The silence in the room stretched into an unbearable eternity. Preston could not tear his eyes away from the glowing television screen. His chest heaved violently as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The realization hit him with the destructive force of a freight train completely obliterating the arrogant foundation he had built his entire identity upon. The man in the midnight blue tuxedo, raising a glass of vintage champagne, was not a maintenance worker. He was the owner of the buildings. He was the architect of the empire. He was J. Vanguard. Preston felt a cold sweat break out across the back of his neck. His vision blurred at the edges as full-blown panic set in. Every single interaction he had ever had with Julian began flashing through his mind, playing back like a horrific highlight reel of his own impending doom. He remembered the first time they met laughing at Julian's work boots. He remembered standing in the dining room just a few days ago tossing a $50 Starbucks gift card across the mahogany table. He remembered looking Julian in the eye and telling him to save up his tips for a nice mop bucket. A wave of intense nausea washed over Preston. He stumbled backward, his expensive Italian shoes slipping slightly on the puddle of red wine he had just dropped. He had spent the last 6 months aggressively courting Vanguard Holdings. He had sent perfectly tailored emails, shipped crates of imported scotch to the corporate office, and begged for a 5-minute phone call. And all the while, the man he was begging for salvation was sitting at his father-in-law's dining table eating Sunday dinner, while Preston relentlessly mocked him. Richard Montgomery took a step closer to Preston, his expression hardening into a mask of pure disgust. The venture capitalist did not become a billionaire by ignoring red flags, and Preston was currently bleeding red flags all over the country club floor. "You lied to us," Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. "You stood here all night pouring our wine and shaking our hands, promising us that Vanguard was reviewing your portfolio. You claimed you were on the verge of closing a $50 million capital injection with a man who your own family just boycotted. If you do not even know what J. Vanguard looks like, then your entire pitch is a complete fabrication." Preston opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was painfully dry. He raised his shaking hands, palms facing outward in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Richard, listen to me," Preston stammered, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. "It is a misunderstanding. The family dynamics are complicated, but the deal, the numbers, they are all real. I just need to speak with him. I can fix this." "You cannot fix anything," Richard snapped, cutting him off entirely. The other investors in the room began murmuring among themselves, pulling out their phones to text their financial advisors. The illusion of Preston's success was evaporating in real time. "If Vanguard is not backing your fund, then your property valuations are completely baseless," Richard continued, ruthlessly dissecting Preston's fraud in front of everyone. "I am pulling my capital first thing Monday morning, and I will make sure every single person in this room does the exact same thing." "No, please, Richard, you cannot do that," Preston begged, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "If you pull out, the fund will collapse. The SEC will start asking questions. I will lose everything. You should have thought about that before you tried to con a room full of veterans," Richard replied coldly. He turned his back on Preston, adjusting his suit jacket. "We are done here." Richard signaled to his wife, and the two of them walked straight toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. Seeing the most powerful man in the room leave was the final nail in the coffin. The rest of the investors immediately followed suit. They set their crystal wine glasses down on the tables, abandoning the expensive caviar and the open bar. They walked past Preston, refusing to even look at him. The mass exodus was swift and brutal. Sierra finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She lunged forward, grabbing Preston's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive jacket. "Preston? What is going on?" she shrieked, her voice echoing loudly in the rapidly emptying room. "What does Richard mean the fund will collapse? Tell them to stay. Do something." Preston violently yanked his arm away from her grasp. "Shut up, Sierra," he hissed, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Just shut up for 1 second. I cannot think." Charles marched over, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and profound embarrassment. The country club board members and their wives were whispering excitedly among themselves, relishing the spectacular downfall of the family that always acted so superior. Charles grabbed Preston's shoulder, his grip tight and unforgiving. "You told me this event was a guaranteed success," Charles demanded, his voice trembling. "You told me the Vanguard proxy was coming. You made me alienate my own daughter on her wedding day for a business deal that does not even exist. You have made a mockery of this family." Preston spun around, swatting his father-in-law's hand away. "Do not pretend you care about Amani now, you hypocrite," Preston yelled, completely losing whatever remaining shred of composure he had. "You hated Julian just as much as I did. You called him a toilet scrubber. You are the one who told the entire extended family to boycott the wedding. Do not try to pin this on me when you were the one holding the match." Vivian let out a loud sob, pressing her hands to her face. "Oh my God," she wailed, her carefully constructed socialite persona completely shattering. "The board members are watching us. The entire club is going to know about this. We are ruined." "We are. Amani is married to a billionaire, and we are standing here looking like absolute fools." Preston pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to stop the room from spinning. The walls of the ballroom felt like they were closing in on him. He was suffocating. He needed $50 million to cover up his fraudulent investments, and the only man on the planet who could give it to him was currently celebrating his marriage to the woman Preston had spent years degrading. Preston dropped his hands and looked wildly around the empty space. The investors were gone. The networking event was officially dead. There was only one desperate, insane option left. He had to go to the wedding. He had to find Julian Vanguard, look him in the eye, and beg for his life. He had to drag this entire pathetic family with him to prove how sorry they were. It was a suicide mission of the ego, but Preston had absolutely nothing left to lose. Preston stood frozen in the center of the devastated ballroom. His mind raced, trying to calculate an impossible way out of the wreckage. Sierra stepped in front of him, waving her hands wildly to break his trance. She refused to accept the reality that had just played out on the massive screen. "There is no way that is real," Sierra said, her voice shaking with desperate denial. "Amani is lying. She probably hired some high-end production company to make that video. She just wants to humiliate us because we did not go to her stupid wedding." "Think about it, Preston. Julian is a maintenance worker. He works in the dirt. He is not a billionaire. It is a pathetic prank." Vivian nodded eagerly, latching onto Sierra's delusion like a drowning woman grabbing a life raft. "Yes, that has to be it," Vivian agreed, smoothing the front of her beaded silver gown with trembling hands. "Amani has always been deeply jealous of you, Sierra. She knew how important this networking event was for Preston and our family. She fabricated that entire video just to scare off your investors and ruin our reputation. I am going to call her right now and put an end to this childish nonsense. We will threaten her with a defamation lawsuit if she does not take that post down immediately." Vivian dug into her expensive designer clutch and pulled out her phone. Her fingers slipped twice against the glass screen because she was sweating so profusely. The remaining country club board members and local politicians who had not fled with the venture capitalists were still lingering near the edges of the room. They were watching the family with intense scrutiny. They had heard Charles bragging all evening about how they were purposely ignoring Amani's wedding to teach her a lesson. Now they were watching the matriarch of the family scramble to do damage control. Vivian found Amani's contact and pressed the call button. She tapped the speaker icon so Charles and Preston could hear Amani admit to the prank. The phone dialed out, sending a hollow ringing sound into the quiet ballroom. Vivian forced a stern, authoritative expression onto her face, preparing to scold her daughter, just like she had done for 29 years. The ringing stopped abruptly. A cold, automated voice echoed from the small speaker. "The number you have reached is unavailable." Vivian blinked, staring down at the screen in confusion. She pressed end and dialed the number again. The same automated message played immediately. "The number you have reached is unavailable. She blocked you." Charles whispered, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He realized the terrifying finality of that automated voice. My father was a man who believed money and status could fix any mistake, but you cannot buy access to someone who has completely severed the connection. She actually blocked your number, Vivian. Let me try, Sierra snapped, pulling out her own phone. She quickly found Amani's name and dialed. The automated voice played again. Sierra let out a frustrated shriek and tried texting her. The message immediately bounced back with a red error icon. She blocked me too. Sierra cried out, her voice cracking with genuine panic. Why would she block us if it was just a prank? Preston, you have to call her. She does not have your number blocked. Preston looked at his wife with eyes completely devoid of hope. He slowly pulled his phone from his pocket and opened his messages. He did not need to call to know the truth. He opened the social media app and refreshed the feed. The video was still there. It already had thousands of likes and comments from the most powerful executives on the East Coast. Every single comment congratulated Jay Vanguard on his marriage. Prominent senators, tech founders, and real estate magnates were all publicly validating the identity of the man in the midnight blue tuxedo. It was not a prank. It was the absolute, undeniable truth. He is real, Preston said, his voice barely above a hollow whisper. It is him, Sierra. The man I threw a gift card at is Jay Vanguard. The man you called a toilet scrubber owns the building my firm operates in. He owns the banks that hold our mortgages. He owns everything. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The wealthy wives of the country club board members who had been standing nearby heard every single word. The pieces finally snapped together in their minds. Mrs. Kensington, a prominent socialite who Vivian had spent the entire evening trying to impress, stepped forward. Her expression was a mixture of absolute shock and profound disgust. "You boycotted his wedding," Mrs. Kensington asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "Vivian, you spent the last 3 hours telling us your daughter was marrying a dangerous charity case. You told us you were protecting your family legacy by refusing to attend. But the truth is, you were just too blind to see who he really was. You abandoned your own daughter on her wedding day because he wore work clothes." Vivian stammered, taking a step toward Mrs. Kensington with her hands raised in a pleading gesture. "No, Eleanor, you do not understand," Vivian begged, dropping the facade entirely. "We did not know. He tricked us. He never told us his real name. We thought he was just a common laborer." "That makes it infinitely worse," Mrs. Kensington replied coldly, taking a step back as if Vivian's presence was contagious. "You judged a man by his coveralls and threw your own child away for a networking event. It is the most repulsive display of greed I have ever witnessed, and it backfired on you spectacularly. Your family is a total disgrace." Mrs. Kensington turned to her husband and signaled for them to leave. The other board members and local politicians did not need any further prompting. They set their drinks down and headed for the heavy oak doors. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a family that had just publicly humiliated the most powerful real estate tycoon in the city. To associate with Charles and Preston now would be professional suicide. Vivian watched them walk away, her chest heaving as the social standing she worshipped crumbled to dust. She let out a loud, dramatic wail and collapsed into a nearby chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Charles stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway, realizing his country club membership and his pristine reputation were gone forever. Preston could not care less about their social standing. He only cared about the federal auditors waiting for him on Monday morning. He grabbed Sierra by the arm and yanked her toward him. "We are leaving right now," Preston ordered, his eyes wild with desperation. "We are going to that botanical garden." Sierra looked at him like he was insane. "Preston? We cannot go there," she cried, struggling against his grip. "We canceled our RSVPs." We laughed in her face. "The security will not even let us in. I do not care if I have to climb the stone walls," Preston roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses left on the tables. "My fund is dead. I am going to prison if Vanguard does not sign that paperwork. We are going to drive to that wedding. We are going to find Amani, and we are going to beg on our hands and knees until she forgives us. Tell your parents to get in the car right now, or I swear to God I will leave you all behind to rot." Preston released her arm and stormed out of the empty ballroom. Sierra wiped her ruined makeup and rushed to pull her sobbing mother out of the chair. The delusion was officially over. The nightmare had begun. As Sierra and Preston disappeared down the carpeted hallway, Charles stood completely frozen. He looked at the shattered glass and the spilled wine staining the expensive floorboards. Vivian was still slumped in the chair, crying into her hands. Before Charles could even process the magnitude of their public humiliation, a sharp, buzzing sound broke the heavy silence. It was his cell phone vibrating violently in the breast pocket of his suit. Charles slowly reached into his pocket. His hands were numb. He pulled out the phone and looked at the glowing screen. It was his older brother, Lawrence. Lawrence was the very first person who had agreed to boycott the wedding in the family group chat just a few days ago. Charles swiped the screen to answer, expecting his brother to offer some sort of comfort or advice. He brought the phone to his ear. "Have you lost your absolute mind, Charles?" Lawrence screamed through the speaker. His voice was so loud and filled with such raw fury that Charles actually had to pull the phone away from his ear. Vivian stopped crying for a moment, looking up with red, puffy eyes. "Lawrence, please calm down." Charles started trying to use his usual authoritative tone. "We are dealing with a crisis right now." "You are dealing with a crisis," Lawrence roared, cutting him off completely. "Do you have any idea what you just did to this family? My logistics company has been struggling for 2 years. I have been trying to get a meeting with Vanguard Holdings since January to secure a shipping contract that would save my business. And you knew this, Charles. You knew how desperate I was." "I did not know it was him," Charles stammered, his voice weak and defensive. "He told us his name was Julian. He was wearing work boots, Lawrence. How was I supposed to know?" "Because he is your son-in-law, you arrogant fool," Lawrence yelled. "You were so busy judging him for wearing coveralls that you did not even bother to learn his last name. You manipulated the entire family into boycotting the wedding of the most powerful real estate mogul on the East Coast. Do you realize who was at that wedding? The mayor was there. The founder of Global Tech Dynamics was his best man. If I had been sitting in one of those chairs, I could have networked with people who could change my life in a single evening. Instead, I am sitting in my living room because you told me to support Preston's pathetic fraud of a hedge fund." Charles swallowed hard, feeling a massive knot form in his stomach. "Lawrence, you are my brother. You need to stand by me," Charles pleaded. "I do not need to do anything for you ever again," Lawrence spat back. "Amani blocked my number. She blocked all of us. Because of your pathetic obsession with country club status, you made the entire bloodline look like gold-digging hypocrites to a billionaire. Do not ever call me again." The line went dead. Charles stared at the screen in pure shock. Before he could even put the phone down, it started ringing again. This time it was his sister Beatrice. He did not answer. He let it ring. But the phone just kept vibrating. Then came a call from his nephew David. Then cousin Sarah. The notifications began pouring in like a relentless digital avalanche. The extended family group chat, the exact same chat Charles had used to orchestrate the mass betrayal, was now exploding with unbridled rage. Charles opened the text thread. His eyes darted back and forth as he read the messages pouring in by the second. They were vicious. Cousin David wrote that he had just lost his job and a single conversation with Julian Vanguard could have secured him a high-level position at Vanguard Holdings. Uncle Robert typed out a furious message calling Charles a short-sighted fool who had doomed the entire family name in the elite business circles of Atlanta. Aunt Sarah demanded that Charles personally reimburse her for the expensive gown she had purchased for the wine tasting, since the entire evening was a fraud. They were tearing him apart piece by piece. They were not mad that they had hurt Amani. They were mad that they had missed out on the money. The realization made Charles feel completely sick. His family was just as shallow and greedy as he was, but now they needed a scapegoat, and Charles was the perfect target. Every single buzz of the phone felt like a physical strike. He had spent decades building his image as the wise, successful patriarch. He paid for dinners, he gave out loans, and he controlled the narrative. But the moment his influence proved useless compared to the staggering wealth of Julian Vanguard, his family turned on him like a pack of starving wolves. Vivian's phone began to ring inside her purse. She jumped slightly, letting out a panicked gasp. She pulled the phone out and saw her sister Clara's name flashing on the screen. Vivian answered it with trembling hands, putting it on speakerphone so she would not have to face the wrath alone. "Clara, please tell me you understand," Vivian cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "We made a mistake, but we are still family." "Family?" Clara laughed bitterly, her voice echoing in the empty ballroom. "You do not know the meaning of the word Vivian. You have spent your entire life treating Amani like she was a stain on your perfect image. You worshipped Sierra and that arrogant husband of hers. You dragged all of us into your toxic favoritism, and now we are all paying the price." "Clara, please, we did not know," Vivian begged, fresh tears spilling down her ruined makeup. "You did not want to know," Clara snapped back viciously. "You wanted a reason to hate Amani because she refused to be your puppet. And now she is married to a man who could buy and sell your precious country club before breakfast. Amani will never forgive us for leaving those chairs empty. The bridge is completely burned, and it is entirely your fault, Vivian. I hope you and Charles enjoy your empty house, because nobody in this family is ever speaking to you again." The call disconnected with a sharp click. Vivian dropped her phone onto the carpet. It shattered the screen, spiderwebbing across the glass, but she did not even care. She looked around the grand ballroom. The luxurious velvet drapes and the melting ice sculpture suddenly looked like a cheap, pathetic joke. They had sacrificed their own daughter on the altar of public opinion, and in return, the public had completely destroyed them. Charles felt a cold sweat dripping down his back. The notifications on his phone finally stopped. He had been forcefully removed from the extended family group chat. He was the patriarch, the man who commanded respect, but in less than 20 minutes, he had been entirely stripped of his power. They had no allies left. They had no friends left in the country club. The only thing they had left was a mountain of debt and the terrifying reality of Preston's collapsing hedge fund. Vivian Charles whispered, his voice hollow and defeated. "Get up. We have to go." "Go where?" Vivian sobbed, wiping her face with the back of her trembling hand. "Where can we possibly go, Charles? Everyone hates us. We have to follow Preston," Charles said, grabbing her arm and pulling her up from the chair. "We have to go to that botanical garden. We have to get on our knees and beg Amani to let us in. If Julian Vanguard does not sign that deal for Preston, we will lose the house. We will lose everything." Vivian looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. She finally understood the absolute gravity of the situation. It was no longer about saving face or protecting their pride. It was about sheer survival. They stumbled out of the ballroom, leaving the spilled wine and the shattered glass behind them. They walked out into the cool night air, completely broken and humiliated, ready to grovel at the feet of the daughter they had spent a lifetime throwing away. Preston marched across the perfectly manicured lawn of the Oak Ridge Golf Club, entirely abandoning the slow, arrogant stride he had perfected over the years. The cool night air did nothing to calm the boiling rage and sheer terror churning inside him. He reached his luxury sport utility vehicle parked in the elite guest section and violently yanked the heavy door open. Sierra was struggling to keep up with him, her high heels sinking deep into the soft grass with every frantic step. She was panting heavily, her tight designer dress bunching up awkwardly around her knees as she tried to run. Charles and Vivian emerged from the heavy oak doors of the clubhouse a few moments later. They looked like absolute ghosts. Their pristine posture was completely destroyed. They stumbled down the wide stone steps, moving with the slow, heavy gait of people walking directly to their own execution. Preston stood by the open car door and pointed a trembling finger at Charles. "Get in the car," Preston demanded, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet parking lot. We are going to that botanical garden right now, and you are going to fix this. Charles stopped walking and looked at his son-in-law with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep fear. Preston, we cannot just show up there, Charles said, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming authority. It is a private, secure estate. They have armed guards working the perimeter. We will look completely insane showing up uninvited after what we did to her. I do not care if they have an entire military battalion stationed at the gates. Preston screamed, slamming his open hand against the roof of the vehicle. Do you not understand what is happening, Charles? Richard Montgomery is going to call the federal authorities on Monday morning. My hedge fund is dead. We are all going to lose everything. You are going to lose this precious country club membership. You are going to lose your sprawling house. Unless we get Julian Vanguard to sign a contract tonight, our entire lives are completely over. Now get in the damn car. Vivian let out another pathetic, dramatic sob. She tried to hurry across the dark parking lot, but the heavy hem of her beaded silver gown caught on the jagged edge of a concrete parking block. She tripped forward and fell hard, scraping her knees and the palms of her hands against the rough asphalt. The matriarch of the family, the woman who had spent her entire life ruthlessly judging the appearance and status of others, was now crawling on the filthy ground in a torn dress. Charles reached down to help his wife up, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip her arm. Sierra stood by the passenger door, crying hysterically, smearing her expensive mascara down her cheeks. The polished, perfect image this family had maintained for decades was completely eradicated, replaced by sheer, animalistic panic. They scrambled into the massive vehicle like terrified refugees. Vivian sat in the back seat, weeping loudly into her dirty hands, while Charles sat next to her, staring blankly at the leather headrest in front of him. Sierra took the passenger seat, gripping the door handle tightly as Preston started the engine. He slammed the gear shift into drive and pressed his heavy dress shoe hard against the gas pedal. The tires screeched loudly against the pavement, leaving thick black rubber marks behind as the heavy vehicle lurched forward. They sped out of the country club parking lot, leaving their ruined social standing far behind them in the rearview mirror. The drive to the private botanical garden was a frantic, terrifying blur. Preston was weaving erratically through the late-night city traffic, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were completely white. The dashboard lights cast a sickly pale glow over his sweating face. He was muttering to himself under his breath, desperately trying to formulate a survival plan. "We just need to get in the room," Preston said, his voice manic and breathless. "If I can just get 5 minutes with him face to face, I can explain the numbers. I can tell him the false property valuations were just a massive clerical error. Charles, you need to tell him you were trying to protect Amani. Tell him you were just acting like a concerned traditional father." Charles looked out the dark window, watching the streetlights blur together. He will not believe that Charles whispered, sounding like a broken man. "He is a billionaire, Preston. He is not stupid. He knows we boycotted the wedding because we thought he was a janitor. We threw a $50 gift card at his face in my dining room. He is going to utterly destroy us." "You will make him believe it," Preston snapped violently, swerving around a slow-moving sedan and running a solid red light. "You will fall on your knees and beg if you have to. Vivian, you will cry and tell Amani how much you missed her today. You will tell her you were having a severe medical panic attack and simply could not make it to the ceremony. Sierra, you will tell her you are so happy for her. We are going to walk in there, and we are going to play the loving, supportive family. We are going to grovel and humiliate ourselves until they forgive us." Sierra wiped her ruined face and began practicing her fake apology, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I will tell her I was just jealous," Sierra muttered, her eyes darting back and forth in the dark cabin. "I will say I was intimidated by how much Julian loved her. She will believe that. She always wanted me to validate her. If I give her the sisterly bond she has been begging for all her life, she will force Julian to sign the investment deal." Vivian let out a loud wail from the back seat, looking down at her scraped knees and her ruined beaded gown. "My dress is completely destroyed," she cried, pulling at the torn silver threads. "How can I walk into a billionaire wedding reception looking like this? The mayor of the city is there. The founder of Global Tech Dynamics is there. They will look at me and they will laugh. They will see me like this, and they will know we are absolute frauds. Nobody cares about your stupid dress, Vivian Preston yelled, his eyes wild and bloodshot as he glared at her in the rearview mirror. We are talking about federal prison. We are talking about total bankruptcy. If you do not play your part perfectly tonight, you will be wearing a cheap canvas prison uniform by next month. So you better start practicing your tears right now. The tension inside the heavy metal box of the vehicle was entirely suffocating. They were four deeply toxic people who had spent their entire lives treating others like worthless dirt, and now they were racing desperately toward the very person they had so casually discarded. They thought they held all the power in the world. They thought their white-collar status made them untouchable gods. But as Preston merged onto the dark highway heading toward the quiet outskirts of the city, the reality of their utter powerlessness finally settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were no longer the elite royal family of the Oak Ridge Golf Club. They were just desperate, terrified beggars racing through the dark, hoping to secure leftover crumbs from the table of the man they had relentlessly mocked. The towering iron gates of the private botanical garden were getting closer with every passing mile, and their pathetic scramble was about to collide with a massive, impenetrable wall. The heavy sport utility vehicle skidded to a sudden halt in front of the massive wrought iron gates of the private estate. The headlights illuminated the towering stone pillars and the thick steel bars that completely blocked their path forward. The estate was completely surrounded by a high brick wall topped with security cameras and motion sensors. The luxury they were used to at the country club was soft and welcoming, but this was a fortress. It was a physical manifestation of the immense wealth and power that Julian Vanguard possessed. Preston gripped the steering wheel, his chest heaving as he stared at the imposing barrier. He rolled down his window, letting the cool night air rush into the stifling cabin of the vehicle. 3 security guards stepped out from the shadows of the stone pillars. They did not look like the elderly men who manned the front desk at the golf club. These men were built like military contractors wearing sharp black suits with discreet earpieces and tactical flashlights hooked to their belts. They moved with absolute precision and completely lacked any sense of customer service urgency. The lead guard walked slowly up to Preston's window, shining a bright, narrow beam of light directly into Preston's sweating face. Preston squinted, raising a trembling hand to shield his eyes. "Good evening, sir," the guard said, his voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "Please state your business at this private residence." Preston cleared his throat, trying desperately to summon his usual arrogant tone, but his voice cracked pitifully. "Good evening," Officer Preston began, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "We are here for the wedding reception. We had a slight family emergency, and we are running a bit late, but we need to go inside immediately to speak with the groom. It is a matter of extreme financial importance." The guard did not even blink. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a digital tablet. "Name, please," the guard asked, tapping the screen. Preston swallowed hard. "My name is Preston, but that does not matter. The bride is Amani and the groom is Julian. I am his brother-in-law. The entire family is in this vehicle. We just need you to open the gates so we can park and go inside." The guard looked at his tablet and then looked back at Preston. "Sir, this is a highly secured private event. If your name is not on the approved guest list, you are not gaining entry tonight." Sierra could not take it anymore. She was used to doors flying open the moment she announced her presence. She forcefully pushed open the passenger door, almost hitting one of the other guards. She stumbled out onto the paved driveway, her expensive heels clicking loudly in the quiet night. "Do you have any idea who we are?" Sierra screamed, her voice echoing off the high stone walls. "I am the sister of the bride. That is my mother and my father in the back seat. You are just a hired security guard. You do not have the right to keep us locked out on the street like common criminals. Open these gates right now before I have my husband buy the company you work for and fire all of you." The lead guard slowly turned his head to look at Sierra. He took in her ruined makeup, the tear stains running down her cheeks, and the frantic, unhinged look in her eyes. He was completely unmoved by her tantrum. "Ma'am," the guard said, his tone turning dangerously cold. "The bride explicitly instructed us regarding her family members. She provided us with your names and your photographs this morning. She stated very clearly that under absolutely no circumstances are any of you to be permitted inside this estate. You are permanently banned from the premises." The words hit the family like a physical blow. Amani had not just assumed they would not show up. She had actively planned for their exclusion. She had handed their pictures to armed security guards like they were dangerous threats. Vivian let out a loud gasp from the back seat, covering her mouth with her dirty hands. Charles slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, as the profound humiliation washed over him entirely. They were not just absent from the wedding, they were actively banished from her life. Sierra refused to accept the rejection. She marched aggressively toward the massive iron gates, grabbing the thick metal bars with both hands. Amani Sierra shrieked at the top of her lungs, shaking the gates wildly. "Amani, come out here right now! You cannot do this to us! We are your family! You owe us! You have to let us in!" Her voice cracked, turning into a pathetic, high-pitched wail that completely shattered the quiet elegance of the botanical garden. The two other guards immediately stepped forward, placing their hands firmly on the weapons holstered at their hips. The lead guard looked at Preston, who was still sitting frozen in the driver's seat. "Sir, I am going to give you exactly 30 seconds to collect your wife and back this vehicle away from the gates," the guard warned, his voice carrying a lethal promise. "If she continues to touch the perimeter fence, or if you refuse to leave, I will authorize the immediate use of force, and I will call the local authorities to arrest all 4 of you for criminal trespassing." Preston looked at the armed men and realized his white-collar privilege meant absolutely nothing out here. His expensive suit and his country club membership could not buy his way through that iron gate. The phantom billionaire he had mocked was now completely insulated by a wall of tactical security that Preston could never penetrate. Preston quickly unbuckled his seatbelt and rushed out of the car, grabbing Sierra by her waist and pulling her away from the metal bars. Sierra thrashed against him, crying hysterically, but Preston held on tight, terrified of being thrown in a jail cell on the very weekend his hedge fund was collapsing. Vivian slowly rolled down her window, looking at the towering gates with wide, devastated eyes. The soft sound of triumphant string music drifted over the high walls from the reception tent inside. It was the sound of a joyous celebration, a gathering of the most powerful people in the city, and her daughter was at the center of it all. Vivian realized with sickening clarity that Amani was completely safe inside her new empire, while the people who had abused her for 29 years were left shivering in the dark driveway, entirely locked out of the future. They were exactly where they belonged, on the outside, looking in. The heavy silence outside the iron gates was suddenly broken by the sound of measured footsteps echoing against the stone pathway. Preston stopped arguing with the guards and peered through the thick metal bars. Charles and Vivian froze, their desperate panting loud in the night air. Sierra wiped her ruined makeup and stared into the softly lit gardens. Out of the shadows of the weeping willows, stepping into the glow of the perimeter lights, came the bride. I walked slowly toward the front entrance of the estate. I had seen the security alert on the monitors inside the reception tent and decided to handle the situation myself. I did not rush. I moved with the quiet grace of someone who was entirely in control of her domain. My custom silk gown flowed elegantly around me, the intricate pearl beading catching the light with every step. I did not look like the disappointment of the family anymore. I looked like royalty. I stopped a few feet away from the iron gates, maintaining a safe and powerful distance between myself and the chaos bleeding out on the street. The contrast between us was staggering. My family, the people who had spent their entire lives obsessed with appearances, looked completely feral. Vivian was covered in dirt, her expensive silver gown torn at the knees. Charles looked aged and hollow, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Sierra was a mess of smeared mascara and tangled hair, shivering in her thin designer dress. And Preston, the arrogant finance executive who thought he ruled the world, was gripping the iron bars like a caged animal, sweating profusely in his wrinkled suit. The lead guard stepped aside, giving me a respectful nod, but he did not unlock the gate. I stood there looking at them through the thick steel bars. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply observed them with a bone-chilling calmness that seemed to terrify them more than if I had been screaming. Vivian was the first to break the silence. She threw herself forward, pushing past Preston to press her face against the cold metal. "Oh, Amani, my beautiful girl," she wailed, her voice trembling with forced emotion. "Look at you. You look absolutely breathtaking. I am so sorry we are late, honey. I had a terrible medical emergency on the way to the ceremony. I could not breathe, and your father had to pull over. We tried to call, but the phones were not working." She pushed her dirty hand through the bars, reaching out toward me. "I knew Julian was a wonderful man," Vivian sobbed, forcing large, fake tears to roll down her cheeks. "I always told your father that Julian had such a kind soul. We were just so worried about you, but we are here now. Please tell the guards to let us in so I can hug my daughter on her wedding day." I looked down at her outstretched hand and felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my chest. There was only a cold, sterile pity. "You tore my wedding invitation in half, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly steady and quiet. "You dropped it on your china plate and asked me if I was out of my mind for marrying a toilet scrubber. You did not have a medical emergency tonight. You had a wine tasting event and nobody showed up." Vivian pulled her hand back as if she had been burned by the cold truth. She opened her mouth to argue, but Preston aggressively shoved her aside, taking her place at the bars. He gripped the iron so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He did not care about family reunions or apologies. He only cared about survival. "Amani, listen to me." Preston pleaded, his voice frantic and breathless. "Whatever happened in the past is in the past. We can fix all of this. But right now I need you to do me the biggest favor of my life. I need you to bring Julian out here. Just for 5 minutes, Amani. That is all I am asking." I tilted my head slightly, studying the absolute panic in his pale blue eyes. "Why do you want to see Julian Preston?" I asked smoothly. "I thought he was just a glorified maintenance man. Did you not tell him to save his tips to buy a mop bucket?" Preston squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently. "I was wrong. Okay, I was so stupid and arrogant, and I am begging for your forgiveness." Preston babbled the words pouring out of him in a desperate rush. "My hedge fund is collapsing, Amani. The investors at the golf club saw the video of your wedding. They know Julian is Vanguard, and they know we are not connected to him. They all walked out. Richard Montgomery is going to call the federal authorities on Monday, and I will go to prison if Julian does not sign the investment paperwork tonight. You have to introduce me to him. You have to save us." Sierra stepped up behind him, her voice trembling as she tried to play the victim. "Amani, please," Sierra cried out, gripping the stone pillar for support. "I am your sister. We grew up together. You cannot just leave us out here on the street like garbage. You are punishing me because Mom and Dad always liked me more. That is not my fault. Please just let us in, and I promise I will make it up to you. I will do whatever you want." I looked at Sierra and felt a deep sense of closure. She was still trying to manipulate the narrative, making herself the innocent victim. She completely ignored the decades of cruel jokes, the snide remarks, and the fact that she had laughed in my face just days ago when I asked for her support. "You are right, Sierra," I replied softly. "It is not your fault they favored you, but it is your fault that you enjoyed watching them tear me down." Charles stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. "Please, Amani," Charles whispered, his voice broken. "He is telling the truth. If the fund collapses, we lose the house. We lose the country club. We lose our entire legacy. You have the power to stop this. You are a part of this family." I looked at the four of them, begging and pleading in the dark. For 29 years, I had practically killed myself trying to earn a fraction of the attention they were giving me right now. I had endured endless insults just to be allowed to sit at their dinner table. and now they were on their knees groveling at my feet, not because they loved me, but because my husband had a bank account they desperately needed to drain. "You chose Preston's legacy over my wedding, Charles." I said, my words cutting through the cool air like a blade. "You commanded 56 relatives to boycott the most important day of my life, so you could drink free wine and pretend you were elite. You made your choice. You placed all your bets on Preston's fake empire." I took a single step closer to the gate, looking directly into Preston's terrified eyes. "And Preston? I am not going to introduce you to Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded complete silence. "Julian does not do business with frauds. He does not bail out failing hedge funds that use inflated property valuations to scam their investors." Preston stopped breathing entirely. His eyes widened in absolute shock as the words "inflated property valuations" left my lips. He stared at me through the iron bars, his mind racing, trying to figure out how I knew the deeply buried secrets of his illegal financial maneuvers. The air grew perfectly still. They were waiting for me to scream or curse at them, but my silence was far more destructive. I was not just the bride they had abandoned. I was the executioner of their entire reality, and the blade was about to fall. Preston stared at me through the iron bars, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He could not comprehend how I knew the exact terminology of his financial crimes. Before he could even formulate a pathetic lie, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed behind me on the stone pathway. The 3 armed guards immediately stood taller, adjusting their posture in a show of absolute respect. I did not need to turn around to know who was approaching. The heavy scent of expensive cologne and the warm, comforting weight of a hand resting gently on my lower back told me my husband had arrived. Julian stepped out from the shadows and stood right beside me under the glow of the perimeter security lights. He looked magnificent in his midnight blue bespoke tuxedo, entirely unbothered by the frantic energy radiating from the other side of the gate. He did not look at Charles or Vivian, who were practically vibrating with nervous terror. He did not even glance at Sierra, who was wiping her running mascara and staring at him with her jaw hanging slack. Julian focused his intense, unwavering gaze entirely on Preston. The silence that followed was heavy and electric. Preston took a small, involuntary step backward, his hands finally releasing their white-knuckled grip on the iron bars. He looked at the man he had called a toilet scrubber just days ago and realized he was standing face to face with the architect of his own destruction. Julian slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. His movements were smooth and unhurried. He pulled out a small rectangular object. It was the $50 Starbucks gift card that Preston had tossed across my parents' mahogany dining table. Julian looked at the green plastic card for a brief moment before crouching down slightly. He slid the card through the narrow gap at the bottom of the iron gates. The plastic scraped softly against the stone, stopping exactly at the tip of Preston's ruined Italian leather shoes. "I appreciate the early wedding present, Preston," Julian said, his voice deep and completely devoid of warmth. "But my wife and I will not be needing it. You should probably hold on to that $50. You are going to need every single cent you can find to pay for your criminal defense attorneys." Preston looked down at the gift card as if it were a venomous snake. He tried to speak, but his voice was a pathetic, raspy whisper. "Mr. Vanguard, please." Preston begged, his entire arrogant demeanor completely eradicated. "You have to let me explain the portfolio. The numbers were just aggressive projections. It is standard industry practice. Do not insult my intelligence." Julian interrupted, his tone remaining dangerously calm. "Vanguard Holdings does not invest in fairy tales, and we certainly do not fund Ponzi schemes. My analysts tore your pitch deck apart 3 months ago. You do not own half the commercial properties you claim to manage. You have been taking capital from new investors to pay off the dividends of your older investors. You are not a hedge fund manager, Preston. You are a common thief wearing an expensive suit." Charles let out a loud gasp, clutching his chest, as if he had been physically struck. He turned his head slowly to look at his son-in-law. A Ponzi scheme. Charles whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and profound horror. Preston, you told me those investments were guaranteed. You told me my retirement funds were secure. Preston ignored Charles entirely, keeping his desperate, pleading eyes locked on Julian. We can restructure. Preston babbled, sweat dripping off his chin. I can sign over my voting rights. I will give you majority equity. Just sign the lifeline document tonight. You have the capital. 50 million is nothing to you. 50 million is exactly what I spent acquiring the commercial block your firm currently rents. Julian replied smoothly, crossing his arms over his chest. I am your new landlord, Preston. I know exactly how far behind you are on your lease payments. You hosted that pathetic wine tasting event tonight, knowing perfectly well that my office had formally rejected your proposal weeks ago. You lied to every single person in that country club just to buy yourself a few more days of freedom. Sierra let out a loud, piercing sob, grabbing Preston's arm. Tell him he is lying! Preston, she shrieked, her voice completely unhinged. Tell him we are rich. Tell my father you did not lose our money. Preston could not even look at his wife. He just stared at the gift card lying on the dirt. The facade was entirely dismantled. He had spent years pretending to be a titan of industry, looking down on anyone who worked with their hands. He had convinced my parents to worship him and discard me, all based on a massive financial lie. And now the man who actually built things, the man who truly possessed the power Preston so desperately craved, had just exposed him as a total fraud in front of the entire family. Vivian let out a low, agonizing moan, sliding down the stone pillar until she was sitting on the cold, hard ground. She realized that the golden child she had worshipped had married a criminal. Her entire social standing, her wealth, her future, it was all built on stolen money. She had ruined her relationship with her only honest daughter to protect a thief. The irony was suffocating. Charles just stood there, staring blankly at Preston, his mind completely broken by the reality that his trusted son-in-law had stolen his savings. Julian looked at the four of them, shivering in the cool night air. You demanded respect because you thought your zip code made you superior, Julian said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of finality. But out here in the real world, respect is earned through integrity. You have none. You threw my wife away because she refused to bow down to your fake empire. And now you get to watch your own empire burn to the ground from the outside looking in. Julian wrapped his arm tightly around my waist, pulling me slightly closer to him. He looked at Preston with eyes that offered absolutely no mercy. My firm was never going to save you. Julian continued, his words slow and deliberate. We saw the gaping holes in your ledger the second your proposal landed on my desk. But we were not the ones who found the initial discrepancies. We were not the ones who connected the dots and compiled the evidence of your massive fraud. I am just the man who refused to fund your crimes. Preston looked up, his pale eyes darting frantically between Julian and me. What do you mean? Preston asked, his voice cracking. If Vanguard did not audit my books, then who did? How do you know about the specific valuations? Julian looked down at me, a proud, genuine smile breaking through his stoic expression. He kissed the side of my head before looking back at the pathetic group of people standing on the other side of the iron bars. He did not raise his voice, but his words echoed loudly in the silent night. You really should have paid more attention to what your sister actually does for a living, Julian said, looking directly at Sierra and then at Charles. You spent her entire life calling her a disappointment because she became a commercial real estate appraiser. You thought her job was beneath you. You thought she just looked at dusty warehouses. The realization began to slowly creep over Preston's face. The color drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a walking corpse. He looked at me, his mouth opening in silent horror as the pieces finally clicked together in his terrified mind. You submitted the whistleblower report. Preston breathed out, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the words. It was you, Amani. You sent the file to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I stepped out from under the protective weight of Julian's arm and walked right up to the iron bars. I did not break eye contact with him. I wanted him to see the absolute certainty in my face. I wanted him to know that the woman he had spent years degrading was the exact architect of his federal downfall. You made a very critical mistake, Preston. I said, my voice steady and cold. You loved to brag. You loved to sit at my father's dining table and boast about the specific commercial properties your fund was acquiring. You thought I was just tuning you out. You thought I did not understand the big words you were using because I was just a lowly appraiser. But I know the commercial real estate landscape of this city better than anyone. I walk those buildings. I inspect their foundations. I know their true market value down to the last square foot. Preston grabbed the iron bars again, his legs trembling so violently it looked like he was about to collapse. Sierra stared at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying new understanding. Charles stepped forward, his mouth hanging open as he listened to me dismantle the empire he had worshipped. 6 months ago, you bragged about purchasing the old industrial complex on the south side. I continued watching the sheer terror multiply in Preston's eyes. You told my father your fund valued it at $40 million, and you were using it as collateral to secure a massive loan. But I appraised that exact same property 2 years ago for a different client. It sits on a designated floodplain. The foundation is cracked. The roof is completely compromised. The maximum market value is barely $8 million. Vivian let out a sharp gasp from her place on the ground. Charles looked at Preston, the betrayal burning in his eyes as he finally understood the magnitude of the lie. When I heard you say 40 million, I knew immediately that you were cooking your books, I said. So I started digging. I pulled the public records for every single property you ever mentioned at family dinners. I pulled the tax assessments, the zoning permits, and the historical sales data. I spent weeks compiling a complete dossier of your entire portfolio. You did not just inflate the values, Preston. You completely fabricated tenant leases to show projected income that did not exist. You built a $50 million house of cards on a foundation of pure federal fraud. Preston let out a pathetic whining sound, shaking his head side to side. No, Amani. Please. He begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched sob. You do not understand the pressure I was under. The board was demanding returns. I had to make the numbers look good on paper just temporarily until the market bounced back. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not care about your temporary pressure, I replied smoothly. I submitted the entire dossier to them anonymously 3 weeks ago. I included every piece of evidence, every fraudulent appraisal, and every fake lease agreement. I also made sure to send a blind copy directly to the Risk Management Department of Vanguard Holdings because I knew you were trying to use my husband's capital to cover up your crimes. Julian stepped up beside me, looking down at the broken man on the other side of the gate. My compliance team verified her findings within 24 hours. Julian added, his deep voice echoing in the quiet night. That is why your calls were ignored, Preston. That is why your emails went straight to our legal department. We do not do business with criminals. We were just waiting for the federal investigators to finish building their case before we formally cut all ties. The reality of his situation finally crushed whatever remaining strength Preston had left. His knees buckled completely. He collapsed onto the rough asphalt, scraping his expensive suit pants against the dirt. He grabbed the bottom of the iron gates, pressing his sweating forehead against the cold metal. He was sobbing loudly, his broad shoulders heaving as he groveled at my feet. The arrogant white-collar executive who had tossed a $50 gift card at me was now begging for his life in the dirt. Amani, please, you have to call them. Preston wailed, his voice muffled against the iron bars. You have to tell the federal auditors you made a mistake. Tell them the dossier is flawed. If they freeze my accounts, I am finished. I will go to a federal penitentiary, Amani. Please, I am family. Sierra is your sister. You cannot send her husband to prison. Sierra suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. The word prison echoed in her mind, shattering her delusion of a perfect, wealthy life. She lunged forward, grabbing Preston's shoulder and violently yanking him backward. "You lied to me," Sierra screamed, her voice completely unhinged. "You told me we were richer than Julian. You told me we were untouchable. Now you are going to prison and taking my entire reputation down with you." Preston ignored his hysterical wife, crawling back to the gate to look up at me with pathetic, desperate eyes. "Please, Amani," he begged again, tears streaming down his face. "I will do anything." I looked down at the man kneeling in the dirt. "You cannot retract the truth from the federal government, Preston," I said, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "The investigation is already active, your fund is completely dead, and the saddest part is that you could have avoided all of this if you had just possessed an ounce of humility. If you had just respected the career I chose, you would have never bragged about your crimes in front of me. You handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy you, and you were too arrogant to even realize it." Charles stood motionless, staring at his daughter. The daughter he had deemed a failure. The daughter he had banished from his social circles had just single-handedly dismantled the most powerful financial executive he knew. She had not done it with a loud argument or an emotional outburst. She had done it with ruthless, calculated intelligence. My father's face crumpled as he realized the true power I wielded. He had bet his entire legacy on the wrong horse, and now the race was over. I watched Preston weep against the cold iron. He was completely broken, stripped of every title and every inflated dollar he had ever claimed to own. For years he had sat at the head of our holiday tables dictating what success looked like. He had made me feel incredibly small, making jokes about my sensible clothes and my dusty work sites. He had convinced my parents that his way was the only way to matter in this world. Now his entire world was reduced to the rough pavement outside my wedding reception. Sierra fell to her knees next to him, not to comfort him, but because her own legs could no longer support the weight of her collapsing reality. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as she realized her country club lifestyle, her designer wardrobes, and her wealthy friends were all about to vanish into thin air. The federal government would seize everything they owned to pay back the defrauded investors. She was going to be left with absolutely nothing. I looked at my mother Vivian, who was still sitting in the dirt. She was staring at me as if she was looking at a complete stranger. In a way she was. The obedient, quiet daughter who absorbed their emotional abuse was dead. She died the moment Vivian tore that wedding invitation in half. The woman standing before them now was forged in the fire of their rejection. I had taken the very career they despised and turned it into an executioner's axe. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. Removing my neck from under their expensive shoes was not a crime. It was simply survival. I had finally taken my power back, and the view from the top of the empire was absolutely breathtaking. I turned my head slightly, preparing to walk back into the warm, glowing light of my reception tent to celebrate the rest of my perfect night. But my father Charles was not quite finished making terrible decisions. Charles stepped forward, his face darkening with a sudden desperate surge of anger. He could not accept that his youngest daughter, the one he had dismissed her entire life, was holding the executioner's axe. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon the booming, authoritative voice he had used to control our family for decades. "Amani, you will stop this right now," Charles commanded, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You have made your point. You have embarrassed Preston, and you have proven you are smart, but I will not allow you to ruin this family. You will call the federal investigators and you will retract your whistleblower complaint. We are your blood, and you will not destroy the legacy I spent my entire life building." I stopped turning and looked back at him. It was almost comical to watch him try to assert dominance when he was standing on the wrong side of a locked iron gate. "You do not have the authority to allow or disallow anything in my life anymore, Charles," I replied, my voice completely flat. "And what legacy are you talking about exactly? Are you talking about the legacy of a man who manipulates his relatives to boycott his own daughter's wedding? Or are you talking about the legacy of a man who turns a blind eye to massive federal fraud just so he can brag to his friends at the country club?" Charles' face turned a deep shade of crimson. "Do not speak to me like that," Charles yelled, stepping closer to the bars. "I am a respected man in this city. I am a senior member at the Oak Ridge Golf Club. I am a founding patron of the Summer Gala. The people in that club are the most powerful individuals in the state, and they respect the name I built. If you tear Preston down, you tear me down, and I will make sure you are entirely blacklisted from every elite circle in Atlanta. Julian let out a low, dark chuckle. It was the kind of laugh that made the air around us feel instantly colder. He looked at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "You are in no position to blacklist anyone," Charles Julian said, stepping slightly in front of me as if to shield me from the sheer absurdity of my father's threats. "And you really should not be throwing around your status at the Oak Ridge Golf Club. It is a very precarious thing to brag about something you no longer own." Charles froze, his raised finger slowly lowering to his side. "What are you talking about?" Charles demanded, his voice losing its booming edge. "I have been a member of Oak Ridge for 20 years. You cannot touch my standing there. I have friends on the executive committee who will laugh in your face if you try to interfere with my membership." "Actually, we already did," I said, stepping out from behind Julian. I crossed my arms and looked directly into my father's panicked eyes, enjoying the sudden shift in his demeanor. Vanguard Holdings acquired the Oak Ridge Golf Club 30 days ago. It was a quiet private acquisition. The previous management company was heavily in debt and failing to maintain the property, so Julian bought the land, the clubhouse, the golf course, and the entire operating structure for a fraction of its market value. "We own the golf course, Charles. We own the dining room where you just threw your pathetic wine tasting event. We own the very chair you were sitting in when you laughed at my wedding." Vivian let out a strangled gasp, pulling herself up from the dirt. "No," Vivian whimpered, shaking her head. "That is impossible. The board of directors would never allow a buyout without consulting the senior members. The board of directors works for my husband now." I informed her, watching the utter devastation wash over her ruined face. And the very first thing Julian instructed the new financial team to do was audit the membership accounts. Charles took a step back, as if he had been physically struck. His eyes darted nervously between Julian and me. "We found some very interesting things during that audit." Charles continued, my voice echoing loudly in the silent night. "You talk a lot about your wealth and your elite status, but the truth is your finances are a complete disaster. You are drowning in debt, just like Preston. You have not paid your annual membership dues in over 14 months. You have not paid your dining tabs or your locker fees. You have been coasting by on your seniority and your aggressive bullying tactics, intimidating the junior club staff into looking the other way. You have been drinking expensive imported wine and eating caviar on a tab you cannot even afford to pay, pretending you are royalty while your bank accounts run completely dry." "That is a lie," Charles stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "We had a minor temporary liquidity issue, but I was going to pay it. The club manager knows I am good for the money. I have been a loyal patron for decades. You cannot just erase my history there." "The club manager was fired on Tuesday," Julian stated coldly, "and your membership was officially terminated on Friday afternoon." The words hit Charles and Vivian with the destructive force of a hurricane. "We revoked your memberships permanently," I said, delivering the final crushing blow without a single ounce of hesitation. "You and Vivian are no longer welcome on Oak Ridge property. You are completely stripped of your advisory board titles, and your locker privileges have been terminated." The formal eviction notice was sent via certified mail yesterday morning, so you will find it waiting in your mailbox on Monday. But I wanted to give you the courtesy of knowing the truth tonight. The security team at the main gates of the golf club currently has your photographs hanging in their guardhouse, just like the armed guards standing right here. If you ever try to step foot on that property again, or try to attend another elite dinner, you will be escorted away in handcuffs for criminal trespassing." Vivian let out a loud, horrific scream. She clutched her hair, falling to her knees in the dirt right beside Preston. The country club was her entire lifeblood. It was the only place she could go to gossip, show off her designer clothes, and look down on other women. To be publicly banned for failing to pay her bills was a humiliation so profound it completely broke her fragile mind. My friend's Vivian sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing off the high stone walls. My friends are all there. Eleanor Kensington will know. The entire board will know we were kicked out for being broke. I cannot show my face in this city ever again. Charles, do something, tell them they are wrong. But Charles could not do anything. He leaned against the iron gate, his legs finally giving out under the crushing weight of his failure. He slid down the cold metal bars until he was sitting in the dirt right next to his weeping wife and his ruined son-in-law. The great patriarch, the man who had controlled our entire extended bloodline with an iron fist and a fat wallet, was reduced to a broken weeping shell. His son-in-law was going to federal prison. His precious social standing was completely eradicated. His wealth was exposed as a pathetic illusion. And his youngest daughter, the one he had tried so desperately to crush under his heel, had just conquered his entire world. The silence that followed was absolute. They had no arrogant threats left to throw at me. They had no fake financial leverage to use. They were entirely empty. I looked at the four of them broken, shivering and weeping on the dark asphalt, and I knew the war was finally over. I had not just survived their lifelong toxicity, I had completely dismantled the very foundation they stood on. Before Charles could even attempt to formulate another pathetic excuse, a sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the heavy silence. It was coming from Preston's jacket pocket. The sound was jarring against the quiet elegance of the botanical garden. Preston flinched, as if the sudden noise had physically burned him. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out his phone. The screen cast a harsh blue light over his pale, sweating face. He stared at the caller identification for a long, agonizing moment before slowly answering the call and lifting the phone to his ear. He did not say hello. He just listened. The voice on the other end of the line spoke rapidly, and the few words that leaked through the small speaker sounded clinical and unforgiving. I watched as the last remaining shred of Preston's humanity seemed to evaporate right out of his body. His jaw went completely slack. The phone slipped from his loose grip and clattered loudly onto the rough asphalt. Sierra stopped her hysterical sobbing for just a second. She looked at the phone on the ground and then looked up at her husband. "Preston, what is it?" Sierra asked, her voice trembling with a new wave of terror. "Who was on the phone? What did they say?" Preston slowly turned his head to look at her. His eyes were completely hollow. "They froze the accounts," Preston whispered, his voice barely audible over the night breeze. "The federal authorities just executed the seizure warrants. They froze the hedge fund accounts. They froze the personal checking accounts. They froze everything, Sierra." Sierra stared at him, her brain struggling to process the absolute finality of his words. "But we still have the house," Sierra stammered, her hands shaking wildly as she reached out to grab his arm. "We can sell the house, Preston. It is worth $4 million. We can liquidate the assets and pay for a defense team. We can start over." Preston let out a dry, hacking laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. He looked at his wife with an expression of pure manic defeat. "There is no house, Sierra," he said, the words spilling out of him like toxic waste. "I double-mortgaged the estate 6 months ago. I forged your signature on the loan documents to secure more capital for the fund. I took every single cent of equity we had to cover the bleeding, and I lost it all. The bank owns the house now. We have absolutely nothing left." The silence that descended upon the group was absolute and terrifying. Sierra stood completely frozen. Her designer dress, her perfect hair, her country club status. It was all built on a massive, devastating lie. She had spent her entire life looking down on me because she thought she had secured the perfect, wealthy husband. But her perfect husband had just secretly gambled away the roof over her head. A feral, inhuman scream ripped through Sierra's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. She lunged forward with terrifying speed, throwing her entire body weight against Preston. She tackled him hard into the side of the iron gate, her manicured hands turning into violent claws. "You stole my house!" Sierra shrieked, tearing at the lapels of his expensive suit. "You forged my name, you pathetic fraud! You ruined my entire life!" Preston raised his arms trying to protect his face, but Sierra was relentless. She slapped him and scratched him completely, losing her mind in the dirt. Charles and Vivian were too broken and exhausted to even try and stop her. They just sat on the ground watching their golden child tear her fraudulent husband to pieces. Suddenly, the quiet street was illuminated by the sweeping headlights of multiple approaching vehicles. I looked past the violent struggle at the gates and saw 3 large black vans speeding down the private road. They did not look like police cruisers. They pulled to a harsh stop right behind Preston's luxury vehicle. The doors slid open, and a swarm of people poured out holding massive cameras and bright flashing lighting equipment. They were financial reporters and paparazzi. They had been tracking J. Vanguard's movements all week, desperately trying to secure the first exclusive photos of the phantom billionaire's private wedding. They had followed the rumors to the botanical garden, hoping to catch a glimpse of the reception. But instead of photographing a glamorous bride and groom, they found a completely different spectacle waiting for them at the front gates. The reporters immediately recognized Preston. His face had been heavily featured in local financial magazines for years. The bright white flashes of their cameras began going off like aggressive strobe lights cutting through the dark night. They captured every single pathetic moment. They photographed Sierra screaming and physically attacking her husband. They photographed Vivian sitting in the dirt with her torn silver gown, trying to hide her face. They photographed Charles, the great patriarch, slumped against the iron bars looking like a defeated beggar. The journalists began shouting rapid-fire questions over the sound of Sierra's screams. "Preston, is it true the Securities and Exchange Commission just raided your offices? Charles, what is your family doing outside the Vanguard wedding? Are you involved in the hedge fund fraud?" The questions hit them like physical blows, entirely exposing their humiliation to the entire world. They were trapped. They could not escape the blinding lights and the ruthless documentation of their complete downfall. The family that had spent decades meticulously crafting a perfect, untouchable public image was now having their darkest, most pathetic moment broadcasted live to the very elite circles they worshipped. I stood a few feet away from the iron gates, safely insulated from the absolute chaos unfolding on the street. The bright flashes from the paparazzi cameras cast long, shifting shadows across the stone pathway, but the blinding light could not touch me. I watched my mother trying to hide her tear-stained face behind her dirty hands. I watched my father cowering from the reporters. I watched my sister clawing at the man who had destroyed her life. I did not feel the need to gloat. I did not need to scream at them or demand apologies. I did not need to list the decades of emotional abuse they had inflicted upon me. The universe was currently doing all the screaming for me. Standing there, looking at the pathetic wreckage of my toxic family, I realized that my anger had completely vanished. It was replaced by a profound, unwavering sense of peace. For 29 years, I had believed their narrative. I believed I was the broken one. I believed I was the disappointment who could never measure up to their impossible standards. I had bent over backward trying to shrink myself so they could feel bigger. But as I watched them scramble in the dirt under the harsh glare of the media, I finally saw them for what they truly were. They were small, insecure people who hid behind expensive clothes and country club memberships because they had absolutely nothing of value inside their souls. Julian stepped slightly closer, his arm sliding down from my waist to gently interlock his fingers with mine. His grip was warm and grounding, anchoring me to the beautiful reality we had built together. He did not say a word. He just looked down at me, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the perimeter lights. He knew exactly what this moment meant to me. He knew I was finally letting them go. I gave his hand a gentle squeeze. I did not look back at Charles or Vivian. I did not look at Sierra or Preston. I slowly turned my back on the iron gates and the flashing cameras. The lead security guard saw my movement and immediately pressed a button on his tactical radio. The heavy steel mechanism inside the stone pillars engaged with a deep, resonant clunk. The massive iron gates began to slowly slide together. The grinding sound of the metal was heavy and final. As the gates closed, the frantic screams of my sister and the shouting of the reporters were slowly muffled. The blinding white flashes of the cameras were cut off by the thick iron panels. The lockdown was complete. The toxicity, the manipulation, the endless cruelty was permanently locked on the outside. Julian and I walked slowly back up the manicured stone pathway. The air smelled of sweet jasmine and fresh earth again. The triumphant music from the string quartet drifted toward us from the reception tent, wrapping around us like a warm embrace. The tent was filled with people who respected us, people who built true empires, and people who knew the value of genuine loyalty. I looked down at my custom silk gown, completely pristine and untouched by the dirt of my past. I thought about the torn wedding invitation sitting on my mother's china plate. I thought about the 56 empty chairs on the ceremony lawn. They had intended for those empty chairs to be a punishment. They wanted me to feel the crushing weight of their absence, but they had fundamentally misunderstood who I was. Those empty chairs were not a punishment. They were a necessary clearing of the brush. They were the universe creating space for something entirely magnificent to grow in its place. My family had made their choice. They chose the illusion of prestige. They chose the fake wealth of a fraud. They chose the empty chairs. I chose an empire. I chose a man who saw my worth when I was covered in dust, and I chose to stand by him when the world finally saw his power. The people who tried to bury me were now the ones buried under the weight of their own greed. The story was over, and the ending was more perfect than anything I could have ever planned. In the end, my janitor took out the trash.